And without further ado, I am thrilled to introduce our presenters. Victoria Romero is an educational consultant and former elementary school teacher, principal, and coach. She has led professional development for K-12 teachers and leaders on topics like trauma-sensitive strategies, classroom strategies that promote academic success, and establishing school-wide and classroom management systems that promote autonomy, positive well-being, and resilience. Victoria is the lead author of Building Resilience in Students Impacted by ACEs, in addition to the book on which this webinar is based, Race Resilience. Justin Hendrickson has more than 20 years of experience in urban education as a teacher and instructional coach. As a pre-K through 8th grade principal in a community-based, ethnically diverse Seattle school, where 90% of the students are students of color and 65% participate in the free or reduced lunch program. He is focused on implementing a trauma-informed school environment where staff practice culturally responsive pedagogy and use strategies that foster resilience. And finally, Amber Warner is unable to be with us because she is doing her clinical hours right now, but she is a licensed clinical social worker with over 25 years of experience. She has served as a school social worker, a medical social worker, and a behavioral health therapist, and has worked quite a bit with children and families who were exposed to community and domestic violence, drug and alcohol abuse, systemic racism, and other traumas. And Amber is a co-author of the book on which the webinar is based. With that, welcome to our presenters. I'll leave it to you.
Jessica, thank you for that introduction. And that's how excited I am. And it's been our pleasure and our honor to have you as our editor on this work. We'd like to thank also joining us today, Olivia Bartlett, who coordinated this webinar. This is a part of the Corwin team, and our tech support, which is being provided by Melissa. And so to get us started in the time that we have with you, just a reminder that November is Indigenous Peoples Heritage Month, and how easy it is with the technology that we have at our fingertips, literally, that you can integrate the accomplishments of First Nation people, no matter what your content or your subject area is. And it's just, again, a reminder that our children need to know that America's greatness is because of many, many people here in our country. And with that, we're going to dive into the why. Why did we write this book? And so for the next 45 minutes, we're going to share with you 3 major components that are in our work. I'm going to start you off with the why and the what. Then Justin will come in and he will do the how, share with you some work that he and his staff are doing at his school. And then I'm going to come back and hopefully do justice to Amber's contribution in our work. And that is the focus on you as the adult. And so we really believe that in order to have these difficult conversations, things that make us uncomfortable, we need to spend time looking at who we are. And so we're sharing with you a year-long, a 5-year-long actually implementation process. And the whole first year is basically what we're sharing with you today. So in our work, you will see that it really starts at year 1, year 2, and goes all the way up to year 5, and then circles back to year 1, always going back to our beginning. We're not used to in our country. I noticed that we had a participant from Australia and a participant from Canada. But as Americans, we're not used to talking about race, or not race in a way that is authentic, that can impact our practice. So there may be some things today that I say or Justin says that may trigger you in a way that we hope isn't negative, But if it is, we ask that you think about what is it that triggered that emotion. And certainly we'll be talking more about that as we move through our overview. And so our why, oops, see, I did it. So you've had a chance to read that scenario explaining our why. And this is about Michaela Robinson. She is a high school senior. She's a hard worker, very conscientious, and there's a policy in her school that requires all seniors to go and talk to their career counselor. And that's a good policy. We want to know what happens to our students. What are their plans post pre-K to 12th grade? What are they planning to do once they leave our system? She tells the career counselor that she'd like to go to Harvard. The career counselor tells her, you are not Harvard material. And so when you hear about this, can you type in the chat just a few wonderings or questions that you might have in terms of why this counselor would make this subjective observation? So we'll just take a couple of those and just read out loud. So you could just, what do you think happened here? Why does the student want to go to Harvard? What is it about that school that draws him to? Who trains the counselors? What is Harvard material? And again, thank you. And I think I kind of gave it away a little bit. Oops. Whoa. Can you still see my screen okay? Okay. So, oh boy, it's not coming up. This actually happened to our 44th First Lady, Michelle Robinson. And she says when she's talked about this, that she was so racially traumatized that she doesn't even remember the race or ethnicity or even gender of the counselor that made this comment. And so we say that the policy in and of itself isn't a bad policy, but what we need to make sure is that we add to it something that takes it out of the subjective realm and put it into the objective, so that you may want to add making sure that we look at the GPA scores, that we look at any kind of assessment scores that we have on this student, in particular SAT and PSAT scores, as we make these judgments. So this is an example of our why, when policy and the practitioner collide. There we go. Here is our next reason why. I am going to read out 5 different prompts, and I'd like for you to visualize the race and gender, sexual identity of the student that fits these descriptors. AP gifted, highly capable program. Calculus, physics classes. Special ed, emotional and behavior disorder classes. At risk, traditionally marginalized, disadvantaged. Varsity basketball player. Now, if your first imaging, if you were able to do that, was in the dichotomy of Black, white, male, female, you're not alone. We have, this is a part of our work here in terms of understanding that we've been conditioned without realizing that we've been conditioned to think in this dichotomy. The wondering is, how many of you visualize students in these other groups that are in our school? And so again, a big reason why we wrote the book is something called the cut curve effect. So even though the focus is on race, we posture that when we focus on race and when we do well by our racial groups, all students in our systems will benefit. And so that means BIPOC students, white students, and then students who have different sexual identities and different religions, all of the kids that come to us in our work. And so if you will, we'd like to invite you to just share your why. Why did you choose to spend an hour with us looking at race resilience? And once again, we'll just take a few of these comments. What brought you here to us today? Hi, Justine Locke. I can say who I see, and I can also say I believe who the world sees. It's way past time from Charlene. I want to listen, learn, and improve my practice. And we thank you for that. If we were doing professional development with you in person or by Zoom, we would give and devote a lot of time to talking about why are we here and what is it that we hope to achieve. And so one of the conceptual frameworks that we built our book around is the idea that in America, I can't speak for Australia, can't speak for Canada, but for sure in America, BIPOC people and white people, we've all been racialized. And so when we go back to those activities where I asked you first to visualize who is the student that would typically be, that we would think typically is in an AP class, or who is Harvard material, we have these assumptions. And based on our racial positioning, we have certain expectations. And so our book does a lot to unpack what this is the very first year. So year one is all about building a foundation of knowledge, being able to set up that culture so that we can have these conversations because they're difficult. And that's where the resilience piece comes in. It's building up the stamina to have a difficult conversation. When we encounter a negative experience, then how do we bounce back? How do we repair that and bounce back? And that quote is from Isabel Wilkerson. And if you haven't read Cast, we strongly recommend that you do that, and you do that either in a group or with a critical friend. But it's a whole nother way of looking at why certain groups may always end up in certain places on our racial strata in our country. And so just a working definition of racialization, from the time that we come onto the planet, who we are racially is shaped by our family, it's shaped by our community, it's shaped by social media. And so it's what experiences that we have that acculturate us. So we've all been racialized. Another thing about racialization is that it positions us. And so it definitely here in America defines who has it easy and who has to work harder in our culture in order to achieve the American dream. The beauty about racialization, though, and this is what we bring up in the book, that there are ways that we can work on ourselves. And so it's not a fixed state of being. And that's what we read in the chat. You know, people are here because they want to listen, learn, and grow. So when it comes to reckoning about race and how it impacts education, the reminder is that race is always sitting in the classroom, whether you are in an all-white school or whether you are in a mixed school, whether you're in an all BIPOC school, whether you're rural, urban, or suburban, race is always in the classroom. And sometimes race is standing up in front of the classroom. And so for our presentations, I just Googled racist comments teachers have made in class. These are videos. And students have recorded their teachers making these comments, and then they upload them onto their social media. It goes viral, and the next thing you know, it's in the national news. And so what does that tell you about our kids? It's like they recognize that these are not the things that a teacher should be thinking, feeling, or saying to students. And so we have to remember our kids think differently than we do. When we were looking for, again, the conceptual framework and the premise of why we wanted to do this book, we looked at research as to what, how does it happen? And so we found a study done by Ed Week, summarized by Samuels. And these were kind of startling data points for us, that 75% of the teachers participating in this survey felt that the achievement gap was beyond their locus of control as educators. They saw the achievement gap is problematic because it's bad parenting, they live in a dysfunctional community, the kids aren't motivated to learn. Most startling to me personally was that 38% of the teachers in this study believed the reason why some Asian groups outperform white students is because they're genetically smarter. Let that float around your head for a minute. And then another data point, that kids that go into Head Start or preschool are usually prepared for kindergarten, but they start to decline by the time they get to third grade. Is that the kid or is that us? And then again, another statistic is that the achievement gap persists even when the incomes are comparable. And so in middle class and upper middle class schools, when the students are BIPOC and white, there is still an achievement gap. Not as big, let's say in a school where there are more kids that qualify for free and reduced lunch or may need ELL coursework, but the achievement gap still persists in those settings. And so our work is based on evidence and research about collective teacher efficacy, and that's John Hattie's work about effect size. And the main effect size that impacts positively academic achievement is collective teacher efficacy. In other words, it's me. I make the difference in terms of whether a child learns or not. We also, a foundation is the research on the characteristics and attributes of high-performing, high-poverty schools. Yes, we have them in America. This research has been with us since the late 70s, and it only gets better and better, such as in the study that Johnny Kindley did in 2010, where she just looked at white teachers who were effective in eliminating or minimizing the achievement gap in high-poverty schools. And then the last fundamental piece is research that's just beginning to come out of how the practice of mindfulness mitigates implicit bias. And so those are four main pieces that we use in our book to make a pitch for having building up resilience to have these difficult conversations. And now I'll turn it over to Justin, and Justin is going to share with us what the how looks like in his building.
Thanks, Victoria. And I just want to say that this work, it started before we got going on the book. Victoria spoke to this a little bit earlier about this being a process, and it is a process. We've always said that if there was a magic wand or a silver bullet in education, we'd all be first in line. But the honest to goodness truth is that it's the work, it's the relationships, it's not always doing as it's been done before. And that sort of motto is going into play right now, where we're talking about how do we come back from this pandemic different? Because what we know for a fact is school has not worked for everyone. So my background is I've been serving in Title I schools my whole career, specifically African-American communities of color. And I feel that I've been very successful in building relationships and building community within these schools because of the relationships, because of the ability to get to know folks on a real level. But I also, there were some things that I really didn't think about that, as I started to work with Victoria and Amber, really had me analyze my own racialization as a white man being brought up here, in Ohio, in Seattle, in a more rural area here in Washington. And how do I show up? And as a school leader, we know this is a challenge. And we always say too that our students are some of the best BS detectors in the world. They know when we're coming as our authentic selves. They also know when we're trying to be someone that we're not. And so that's an area that we're leaning into. So one of the first things that we did at South Shore, and this was before I became principal, is really looking into the students and the community that we serve, and doing this from a strength-based perspective. So many times we make assumptions about communities because of what we read in the paper or what other folks tell us about how the school is. But we also know to be true is that I've never met a family that does not want their kid to be successful. I've never met a family that isn't working the hardest that they can to have their kids do better than they did. And that is what we work and we strive for. So our demographics here are 90% BIPOC students and families. We serve about 20% English language learners. At one point in time, this zip code was called the most ethnically diverse zip code in the nation. About 20% special education. 66% free reduced lunch. And at this point, we have shifted some of our demographics as far as staff. And so right now in Seattle, which is not necessarily a hotbed for diversity in many ways, we work really hard to get more staff in front of our students that look like our staff and staff from our community. And that means that we've worked really hard to engage with our Somali community, to get our Somali moms who would be hanging out at our school all day, jobs here at school. Our leadership team here is myself and my two assistant principals. One's an African-American woman from this community who went to this school. Another is a Vietnamese-American leader who also has the experience of being an EL learner as well. And so this is a way that we've really tried to embrace how we are trying to get how to meet folks where they're at, and how to make an environment welcoming. But we also know, and this is true across the nation, that the majority of our teachers are white women, and the schools that many of us serve in do not look like the schools that we were brought up in. And so there's a disconnect there. We also know too that when we dig into our data, we are not serving the same students. I don't care if you're in Brooklyn, if you're in Illinois, if you're in California, the results are not equal. And you can see as we dug into our data, our Asian students and our white students are outperforming our students, are specifically our African-American students and our Black students. And for us, that means a high number of African students from Somalia, from Ethiopia, Eritrea. And so we have a lot of work to do. And one of the first things we have to do is own that work, and own it as this is our community. We do have locus of control. As Victoria said earlier, and I forget the exact quote, and it's a scary quote, but as a teacher, we set the weather in our classrooms. We can talk about how things are out of our control, but when it gets down to it, when that door closes in your classroom, you're the one who sets the weather in there. And that's a scary space to be sometimes. But one of the things that I really was working towards is how to come in compliance with our district policy 0030. And that's ensuring educational and racial equity. And to do that, we dug into our social emotional learning as well as our racial equity team. And for me as a school leader, it went past just the talk. It went to how do we prioritize this? If I say this is a school priority, if this aligns with our district goals, how do we not just talk the talk? How do we walk the walk? And so what that means is we have given one of our 2 days a month, all staff professional developments to our racial equity team to lead us together. And this is a big sell because as a principal, I really only get a couple hours a month with my whole staff. But I know that for us to move the needle academically, we have to address that elephant in the room. Like Victoria said, race is in every classroom that we have. If we don't address this, we're not doing the work. The social emotional work is work that we all need to do collectively. And even though many of our students come with many ACEs checked off, meaning they've had adverse childhood experiences, that does not define them. And we often say too that if us as adults were impacted the same way some of our students were, that's when we start calling in sick. That's when we start taking that personal time. That's when we start second guessing ourselves on the work that we're doing. But we know that our kids, and it's been proven, if you're sitting in a school like I am today, our kids are resilient. They need no more grit. They're resilient. They want to come to work. They want to learn, but they need the adults to meet them halfway. So we started to we had some starts and stops, and that's another thing I really want to just emphasize in this work. It's not easy work, but it is the work. Literally, my sleeves are rolled up every day here to do this work. And so my former principal has some experience with affinity groups. And so we jumped right into affinity groups. And truth be told, they bombed. It was not the right move. And even though it was successful at a previous school, we hadn't done the foundational work as a staff to actually get into our own spaces to have these difficult conversations. So we had to back up. We had to back up, and we had to start examining ourselves and how we showed up in the classrooms. And that meant that we had to start with some book clubs. We had to look at the Harvard implicit bias test. We had to really start to see, intentionally or unintentionally, how we were setting the weather on our classrooms that was causing storms outside. And so we baby stepped it in there, and we really had to, as a whole staff, agree that this is the work that we were going to do. We were going to speak our truths. We were going to bring our own experiences to the table so that we could learn from each other, because as people have said in the chat, our kids deserve it. And the reason that we're here is to be better for our students. So not everyone was on board with the book clubs. We had folks who really pushed hard and said, we don't want to do another book club. That's too high level. We want to talk about the real work that we have here. But we knew from that misstep in that year one that we had to set the foundation. We had to come to some common understandings about what racialization was, what it wasn't, as well as the history of the systemic racist society that we live in. And so we started that way, and we gave adults choice. And one thing as a school leader that I know, and you know too, is providing choice and not forcing this. Provides folks with an opportunity to engage at the level that they're comfortable to engage in. And so we brought up Stamped. We did Dr. Kendi's How to Be Anti-Racist. We did The Good Immigrant. So we had several different book clubs that we ran. Folks got to jump into the book club they felt would impact them the most. And we started to have some real conversations. And they were not comfortable conversations. But at the same point in time, like I said, if we say we're about this work, then we have to set the time aside to do this work. So we really went from this high level 30,000 foot view so that we could have some common understanding that we step into classrooms with baggage. We step into classrooms with our own lived experiences that are different than many of our students, but that does not mean that we can't be effective. It does not mean that we can't build amazing, strong relationships, even if you look like me. Because when it gets down to it, it has to be more than I care for kids. I like working with kids. We have to love our kids. So we did the book clubs, and we did about 2 years of book clubs, honestly, with some professional development in between. But also in that, we had to also make it real. We had to get into the meat of it. So in conjunction with our racial equity team this past year, we're getting ready for our conferences. And these are the conferences that many of us typically hold in November. And what we knew from families is families didn't always feel welcome. They didn't feel like they had a place in this classroom. And I know this because families have come to me and said this. So we had to really talk about how do we address the assumptions that we may have about families, even though we may not think that we have assumptions about families. But we have a lot of families their father. We're close to the airport. Their father drives for Uber or Lyft, and they're working odd times, so their meetings may be on the phone as they're in the car. That does not mean that they don't want their kids to be successful. So leadership, in conjunction with our racial equity team, created a small little activity about what assumptions might people have about our own families. So we actually brought our own pictures from our families, and we listed down assumptions that folks might have about our own families. And I think it was really telling as we went through our staff. We have a large staff of almost 100, about the different assumptions that people may have about a family just from looking at a picture. We then correlated that to how we may have some assumptions about families when they step into our space that aren't true. And how do we address these? And it starts with the hopes and the dreams for our families. What do you want for your student? And how can we partner to get there? And it's the ability to say 18 fantastic things about any student in your class. And hopefully you know more than 18, because each student comes to your classroom with a gift, and typically more than one gift. And so when families know that you can recognize those gifts, they engage. So that was one example of how we started to address the ability of staff to show up differently in the classroom. I also believe that with this ongoing partnership with our racial equity team and the PD, we've given voice to a lot of staff members who perhaps didn't feel like their voices were heard in the past. And it's not always just the members of this team. It's kind of like a building leadership team where you have some real key players from your staff who are working together collectively to lift up school goals. But we also know that they have their own set of constituents within a school that they talk to as well. And so we all remember January 6th. We remember how high tensions were at that time. And it came to light that one of our school leaders, a person of color, had posted some things on her Facebook page, which really caused some harm within our community. She had talked about some immigration things. She had talked about some issues around transgender that the racial equity team learned about and they brought to me. In the past, this is a conversation that I probably would have just had with this adult. And I would probably have crossed my fingers and hoped that it sort of slid away. But I knew that this was not the time nor the place to do that. The team had brought it to me. They had talked about the harm that it had done within our school community, as well as our families. Families saw it as well. So what we did is we set up several meetings between myself, the racial equity team, and the school leader. And we talked about what had happened. We addressed the harm in partnership with myself. we created a work list for this staff member to attend to, including some reading, attending the racial equity team meetings on a regular basis, and also reaching out to several families that had reached out to me personally and said that they were harmed by what was posted. Even though this was a private page, it had a public impact. And so the ability for us to have these conversations and not shove things under the rug, I think has helped make us stronger, and has also lent more credence to the ability to have these difficult conversations because they're always there. Whether you want to address them or not, they're there. So one of the things that I really wish I had when we were starting this is a checklist. As I said earlier, we jumped right into this work. We didn't put our toes in the water. We jumped right in. We jumped right in affinity groups, and they didn't go well. And I knew that now that what we didn't do is we didn't build that foundation that Victoria spoke of. We didn't talk about where we want to get. We didn't talk about our vision. We didn't also do some work on what are we already really good at here at school? How can we leverage some of those strengths? And what we really missed the boat on was assessing that level of trust and readiness to have the courageous conversations. We didn't set that space up. And so when we did break off into our folks of color group, our white group, our mixed race group, they didn't talk. They didn't trust each other to have these conversations. And at this point, I know that we've done some really good work. One of my principal interns now is an African-American male educator. I've known him for 20 years from just up the street. And he has shared that he has been the only African male educator at his school for almost 15 years. And when he steps into South Shore, he says, I just feel like I can be myself. I feel like I can have conversations with folks that I'm not able to have somewhere else. And at this point, our work at school is really about us as white folks taking on some of this work. Our staff of color have said, we've done a lot of the lifting already. We need you to step up. We need you to have some conversations when things don't go right. And that's where we're really pushing each other because we're still 60% white staff here, serving a community that doesn't always look like us or have the same lived experience as us. And so that's where we're living now. This year, we're still going to do some book clubs. We've got Dr. Goldie Muhammad's book that we're digging into as a staff, but also we have some professional development that are really focusing on our own classroom, on our own school community, examining our school climate data, and why do students in elementary feel safer and more welcome than they do in the middle school? Why do they feel those relationships with adults are stronger in elementary than they are in middle school? And so that's the work that we're continuing to do. Like I said, this is not a one and done sort of drive-by professional development. This is ongoing work that we're doing together. And our next step is really getting our families and our students involved in this as well. And so I'm excited to share on that soon as well. But at this point, I'm going to turn it back over to Victoria, who's going to close out her portion.
And I'm going to remember to unmute myself. And so you heard from Justin that there were starts and stops. They've been working at this for about 5 years, right, Justin? Which is why I asked him to help me with this book, because some of you may have started this work in your schools. And so every school or school district may be different. But the year one checklist that he was referring to, this is in our book. So it has year one and what you do for year one. And remember, year one is laying down the foundation and then creating that culture where there is trust, so that when harmful things happen, you restore those relationships so that you can the conversation. And so this would be the part that Amber would be sharing with you as a therapist. I invited her in to help support this work because your emotions matter. And so literally our chapter 4 is called Educator Emotions Matter. And so we do a deep dive into what happens to us when we are in our professional settings. And just looking at the picture that's on the screen now, we know that in the last few years, we have seen how easy it is to trigger us emotionally around race. And so we know that teachers are just a microcosm of our society. We come into our places with different racial identities, with different sexual identities, with different religious beliefs, with different political ideology. But what does it mean once we cross the threshold and we're one tribe and we're educators? And so that's what we're trying to, like, what does it mean for us? And especially in America, education is now going through another cycle of being very, very political, and how quickly it is that the politics will impact what happens in the profession that we do. And so on the screen now, we talk about what happens when we have racial encounters that are negative and they harm. In the book, we also counter this. So we never give you just the problem. We also give you what we can do to work on those challenges. So even though we're only talking about today the negative encounters that ignite the stress response, and that is fight, and that may make you angry; flight, that may make you shut down if you're not prepared; fright, that may make you want to defend your position. And so that's the stress response. And we know from research that when we are stressed negatively, it increases implicit bias. So we're more likely to make assumptions about a person's racially because we're under duress. And when we're under duress, that increases the probability that might lead to burnout, compassion fatigue, or racial cognitive distortions. And again, we'll talk about that in the next few slides. What are racial cognitive distortions? And so again, a big piece of this work, as Justin shared with you in terms of talking with his staff, is getting people ready to be more self-aware about who they are and what emotionally triggers them when it comes to talking about race, and how do we get over that. So one of the Amber's coursework in her continuing to keep her license updated was a course with Dr. David Burns, where he talked about the top 10 cognitive distortions. And cognitive distortions are basically irrational thoughts that we may have, especially when we're encountering or have encountered a negative, have a negative encounter, and how they influence our emotions and our thinking. So that's cognitive distortions. And so what I'd like for you to do, take a look at this list of 10, because we need to know that all of us float in and out at some point with these 10 cognitive distortions. And so I'm going to model for you, and then I'd like for you to type in the chat the ones that resonate for you. But mine that I can own, 5. I noticed that we have some other people here from Brooklyn. I grew up in New York. I talk fast, I think fast, and sometimes that's not the best thing in certain situations because I'll draw a conclusion fast, and it may not be the right conclusion. I can own 5. I can own 6. I'm a magnifier. My husband is a minimizer, so that we work really well with that. And so if we're talking about something that might have happened that was bad, I'm hyperbole. I'm the queen of hyperbole. I magnify the situation. I blow them out of proportion, and my husband shrinks them. He minimizes them. I can own 8, again, being a girl from Brooklyn. You ask me for advice and I'll do a lot of should, coulda, woulda, must, don't even ask me. Usually I will preference that it's like, do you really want to know the truth? Because I deliver the truth. So I can own number 8 and I can own number 10 when it comes to especially having disagreements with my husband. I can see all of his faults and rarely do I have any in the conversation. So if you will, just start typing in the chat some of these 10 cognitive distortions that you may own. I've got already people are like 3 and 4, 5 and 6. I'm a 7. I'm definitely an 8. So if we were working with you in a professional development setting, after we looked at these 10, we would put you into smaller groups where you could talk about your top 4, your top 3, your top 2. And then we would reassemble you into expert groups where you could really start to unpack your top 2. And again, the thing is to get comfortable with understanding what happens to us when we experience a negative encounter and how we can have cognitive distortions based on that encounter so that we're again striving for awareness. And then Amber, in her work, she took Dr. David Burns' work and she created racial cognitive distortions. And again, everybody in this webinar, including myself, including Justin and Jessica and Olivia, we can float in and out of any of these 5. Racial fatigue. Why do we have to keep talking about race? Yeah, it makes us tired, right? But at the same time, when you think about it, we never really have an authentic conversation about race that gets us to solution. We tend to stay in I'm just tired of this. I just wish we didn't have it. Or I thought when we elected President Obama, it was all over. So we're all tired of dealing with race at some point, but we know that we're not there yet as professionals when we look at our data and who benefits racially and who doesn't benefit racially in our systems. It's the idea of when we're not in that culture that is trusting, that we feel that we have to sit back, think about what we're going to say, ask permission first, always set up our comment, and the comment just may never come. We have racial mindfulness cover up, and I'll be honest with you, I'm doing that right now. I don't have the opportunity that if I said something that offended you or was misunderstood by you, to restore that relationship. And so I'm being very careful, and Justin as well, in terms of how I frame things for our time together. It's just too short. And so that's not a bad thing. But then we also want to get to the point where we're not always having to think that we have to be careful about our language or reading the room or reading expressions. And so again, being the torchbearer, thinking that I'm the person that has to do most of this work, that we don't have a shared responsibility in it. And then the triple threat, what happens to us, as happened to our 44th First Lady, when there is the triple threat of 3-ness, when racism intersects with gender and implicit bias on the part of her career counselor. And so again, when we are able to understand this, able to talk about these things, and again, if we were in a group, we would probably divvy you up into groups and have you take on one of these 5 and just go deep within the group discussion and then come and share out with the total group of what it meant for you so that we can all learn from each other. Remember, year 1 is not even looking at policies and procedures. It's not really going into your classrooms. It's about the work that we need to do to get ourselves ready, because it's not a one-year conversation. It's something that we always want to pay attention to. And so it's like knowing what triggers you, being able to name it, being able to listen to your body, because your body will tell you when you are aroused negatively in terms of a negative encounter. It's about getting and creating that space between so that you're regulating before you act. And if you're a parent of a teenager, you're very skilled at doing this. And if you're a middle school teacher, you're very skilled at doing this, pulling back and taking a breather after a student has said something to you that triggered you. I think number 4 is really critical too, is that finding that colleague who will be honest with you, so that if something happens and you don't understand what you said or did, you can go to your critical friend, and they're not going to agree with you. They're going to take the side, or try to take the side of the other person, so that they can share, well, maybe he felt this way, or maybe she was thinking that way, so that you can grow. And then again, it's owning your own racial mistakes. And if someone tells you that they're offended, even if you don't understand, you offer the apology. And that's, again, when you go back to your critical friend. And Justin does this very well in his school. Even for the baby steps, we celebrate. And so when his staff says, hey, this happened outside of our building, but it impacts inside of our building, and we have a solution that everybody collectively is a participant, and they come up with ways to help this colleague grow. And so just winding down and getting back to curb cut effect. The curb cut effect explains what happens when we started to create sidewalks for one group, and that was for people who needed to use wheelchairs. A study was done in Florida a few years ago, just looking at the effect of curb cuts and pedestrian walking. And what they found was curb cuts started to work for people pushing baby strollers, for people pushing carts or pulling luggage. Skateboarders loved it. The startling thing was they found that 9 out of 10 walkers, people who could have stepped down off the curb, didn't step down off the curb. They actually used the curb cut. And so again, as educators, we come from all different walks of life. We focused our book on race because our feeling is if we can fix that, then all of the kids and all of the adults working in our system will benefit. And so I just thank you for your time. That brings us to a close so that we can have some time for question and announcing who our winners are. Thank you for your time today.
And so now we'll get to some of your questions. I saw a few. We do only have like 3 minutes. We might not get to all of them. So Jill asked, I believe this is a question for Justin. Do you experience resistance from the not CRT crowd? And then Audrey had a follow-up of how much energy do you spend convincing that crowd that isn't really interested in being convinced?
Yeah, every day we have resistance. But my hope is that we can go with our goers. And also I think that once people see the impact of the self-reflection, they see the impact of the work that they're doing, it makes them want to engage. And I think, like I said, we made some missteps and we'll make some more. But finding multiple areas of entry for folks is really crucial. Some folks may just want to live in the book club world, but other folks are going to get knee deep in this. And then they're going to help lift others up as well. And where I've also found some of the power is when families start to see that folks, specifically some of their white teachers, are doing this work together. The relationships are stronger. And these are relationships, when I taught second grade years and years ago, and these kids are old now, like I still see families who are engaging with me and talking about some of the work that we did together. So the resistance is always going to be there, but this is the work that we have to do because it matters, and our kids deserve it.
Great, thank you. And then one more question. Angelique asked, what suggestions do you have for an African-American ELL teacher who has been speaking to admin about the need to add more racially diverse staff?
You know, we're in Washington State, and as Justin said, that's not an option for us. It would be nice if we could. If you are in a place on the East Coast, you know, go to those universities that historically Black universities that are turning out educators of color. But in our state, and this is why we say we need everybody to be, able to talk about race and look at their kids in different ways and in terms of their strengths. And so there's some things that BIPOC people need to do as well. And we cover that in our book. It's internal racism. Just because you're a person of color doesn't mean that you haven't been negatively impacted, and may even look at kids who look like you and not see strengths. So we look at everybody in the mix, but if recruiting from historically Black colleges is probably what I would recommend.
And you can start small. I mean, at any school, there's probably a couple other critical friends. And then there gets to be a little power in numbers too. And be persistent, stay persistent.
Great, thank you both. And we are out of time. So thank you all again so much for joining us. If you have any questions that didn't get answered, or you have some questions that didn't come up, you can send them to us at info@corwin.com, and we'll send those along to the presenters. We hope that you'll join us again for another Corwin Monday afternoon webinar in the future. All right, goodbye everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.